Hostilities of an American Civil War. New Jersey divided in the American Revolution. New Jersey endured 2 civil wars in her existence. The Second Civil War, the war between the states, did much to create our modern New Jersey. The decade leading up to the American Civil War saw the finalizing of our county's borders and the repositioning of the 2 great cities that lie across the waterways that form the jutting landmass. During the conflict, much of what would become municipal and county land was first set aside for the parading and drilling of regiments from the Garden State. Industry boomed to supply the war effort, and a unity here in New Jersey was finally reaffirmed. The First Civil War, the war between the state, did much to create the American nation. It was a far more brutal civil war for Jerseyans. The late 1700s conflict divided the mid-Atlantic breadbasket sharply between Tory and Patriot. Often entire regions of the peninsula swayed one way or the other. This would accelerate brutality as both views jostled to control her resources. Reprisals of confiscation against the civilian population was common during this time. Retribution far worse could be expected by the participants. A list of characters so Jersey, heroic and villainous, would emerge from the struggle of independence. These actors performing on Nova Caesaria's greatest stage lent massively to the identity defining her people even today. Here are the 3 Revolutionary War-era partisan events that speak to the hostilities in New Jersey. New Jersey, a poignant microcosm for the creation of the United States. First Battle of Monmouth. The first, almost forgotten engagement at Monmouth Courthouse was a key development in a brief but impacting war period known as the Loyalist Ascendancy. General Howe ordered the forming of new Tory militias to harass and help trap the American threat by splitting New Jersey in 2. In perfect position for Howe's endgame, Monmouth County was heavily Loyalist at the time. By January 2, 1777, at Monmouth Courthouse, provincial colonels Elijah Lawrence and John Morris had gathered a regiment of between 200 and 250 men loyal to the king. A small but local force that prudence necessitated to keep Howe's army's logistics and hence morale at superior levels. Washington scouts immediately delivered word. Not wanting a thorn stuck in his side as he began the reconquest of Nova Caesarea, General Washington ordered the 11th Pennsylvanian, with about 120 men under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gurney, and a contingent of 80 men from Delaware, under Major Thomas Rodney, to disperse the king's raw recruits with haste. This tiny engagement and American victory was not, however, inconsequential. The aftermath would change the face of the new conflict in New Jersey. Post-skirmish, the British became hemmed up, only controlling the more developed settlements of New Brunswick and Perth Amboy. A 3-month guerrilla war would ensue, as both sides desperately needed supplies. In direct result of this action, a large many men subject to the king abandoned well over 100 farms, maybe more. These hinterland farms could no longer supply His Majesty's troops. The results unexpectedly forced Howe to change his entire strategy, and the meantime hunger and the forage war would take a toll on his army's morale. The Loyalists dispersed and had to abandon their homes for the safety of Staten Island. The Patriots promptly seized all their lands, assets, and grain stores, upping the stakes for the Tories. With nothing to lose and vengeance in every thought, those who escaped this action would become the core of the New Jersey Volunteers. The New Jersey Volunteers became arguably the most effective militia unit for either side during the war. They proved themselves quick, efficient, ruthless, and deadly. Isaac Winans Sr. capture. Sugarhouse Prison, Lower Manhattan, New York. Isaac Winans Sr. of Elizabethtown, his land in the modern city of Linden, was 65 in 1774. Isaac served his area along the Arthur Kill in a 33-man committee to legally serve our grievances upon the Crown. Upon the exhaustion of a peaceful legal resolution, the senior took on substantial roles on committees to organize resistance as well as official correspondence. As part of his official capacity, his signature would be among warrants to reap his lands and assets from loyalist neighbors who escaped Washington's reconquest of the Garden State in 77 and 78. One such acquisition of private property by the Patriots was against the notorious and vindictive Cornelius Hatfield, Jr. Hatfield's farmlands, orchard, and cider mill were taken. Isaac Sr. and his son Isaac Jr. were kidnapped from their Elizabethtown tract, now modern Linden home, in January of 1780. This was one of the coldest dead winters of the Little Ice Age. The abduction occurred in the middle of the night, and the two prisoners were forced to travel in their own sleigh all the way to Lower Manhattan. The Winans would be imprisoned at the infamous Sugarhouse prison after the all-night and possibly two-day trek across the frozen Newark Bay and Hudson River. Isaac Sr., 70 at the time, would die in his cell 3 days after being interned. It is still not clearly recorded if this raid was carried out by Captain Hatfield. Still, if we account Winans, a neighbor, as the immediate authority for the confiscation of the Hatfield orchard, mill, and farm, then apply how Hatfield directly applied vengeance, known through several accounts of the cruelty of his method, it is very likely he was the lead perpetrator of this episode. In turn, other Winans kin upped their own patriot resolve. Ben Winans led the Klan's resistance, which would not be with the Continentals, but the first with the Essex militia. Himself, along with his nephew, would then post with the New Jersey state troops and be in perpetual conflict, holding the most stagnant front line of the war for 6 years. We have no absolute knowledge if this event against his uncle pushed his commitment. However, we do know after the event he took commission and extended commitment with the Jersey state troops, while his son took over his Essex militia command. It may not have been the only factor, but it surely must have added to his intent. Hornets Rise, the experience of the French and Indian War, a precursor to 21st century warfare. A hornet's nest became a common 18th century idiom all across Europe as the spreading of malicious confusion. It is an obvious euphemism for chaos and destruction. During the course of the war, several Hessian soldiers would use it in their writings or when speaking about the particular hot zones of the conflict. When Washington and the Continentals crossed the Delaware and New Jersey's first Civil War went in full swing, the men who took command of the resistance were seasoned. Just like the Continental commander, General Washington, these middle-aged partisans procured a style of fighting adverse to the invaders in the 7-Year War's conflict. Woodland guerrilla fighting tactics as well as, though limited, street-to-street urban warfare proved essential. Much is made by Anglophile historians about the overall lack of American victories in large-scale battles. This is erroneous in terms of understanding the war for independence. This war was not fought this way by the victors. It is fair to say that the British failure to proficiently adapt to an easily recognizable precursor to modern warfare as the Crown's downfall in the colonies. For the most part, the field did not matter in battle to the colonials. The colonies were able to control much of the resources and supply lines needed by the British, regardless of main army actions. If flushed out in Jersey, those defenders would just appear again, often without warning, and then disappear again. In 1777, this inflicted moral fatigue to then Howe's army. Starved for supplies, redcoats and Hessian troops in New York endured brutal winters. 1777 through 1778, the majority of the army relied on salt pork, among other rations supplied from as far away as the Caribbean and the British Isles alike. Looking across small Arthur Kill from Staten Island in hunger, these troops were forced to supply the breadbasket for the New World's two biggest cities. The Crown's regulars and mercenaries weren't often denied for lack of endeavor. The insurgency would raid across into New Jersey frequently. Sometimes they would have success. That said, for 6 years it was never easy, as resistance was the norm. Movements were often relayed quickly by patriot women and militia men, though often outnumbered and outgunned, could deprive the expedition of intended goals. Albeit, as many historians would make a point to say, Jersey would be forced to give up the field. A hollow victory in its most literal sense. The Hornets of New Jersey were first denoted with this 18th century title for stiff total defense. The buzzing fighters from the swamps to the mountains not only fought a guerrilla war of attrition, these warriors used mobility, engaging in street-to-street urban as well as hit-and-run frontier-style battling. The Patriots in New Jersey menaced columns of British and Hessian troops routinely. Proficient at times living off the land, the colonials could attack without warning and fade away from retaliation as quickly as they appeared. After several battles, win or lose, on Nova Caesaria's soil, the militias would continue harassment of the marching invader all the way back to the British fortification and camps. This demoralized even veteran troops not used to this sort of resilient opposition. A passage from a Hessian soldier's journal describing the war in New Jersey. It is almost impossible to surprise the enemy on any occasion, because every house that one passes in an advanced picket, so to speak. For the farmer, or his son, or his servant, or even his wife or daughter fires off a gun, or runs by the footpath to warn the enemy. Taken from an entry in the MS Journal of a Hessian soldier from the Jaeger Corps, August 18, 1780. A true animus between neighbors certainly grew from the covert nature of intelligence gathering during the war. Even after the 2-year liberation of New Jersey, the Crown still had supporters in which to rely, while the Continentals in turn exploited the British necessity for intelligence with double agents. This uncertainty between friend and foe did account for escalations, sometimes involving kin. Washington's implementation of spy networks such as the Culper Ring have been in recent times highlighted for its effectiveness, aiding the more modern-style strategy used by the Americans. This praise and illumination is rightfully deserved. However, Washington most relied on the field intelligence acquired by the Hornets. They didn't always confront British movements, but often relayed them, remaining concealed. This sort of intelligence aided in unit positioning and occasionally routing out British sympathizers.